Everyone to the REIA Now March 18th Friday call. I know you guys have been on here for a little while. I apologize for my absence earlier, but was unavoidable. But I'm here now. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rebecca McLean.
Thanks so much, Ryan, and thanks to all of you for being here for our very first virtual day on the Hill. We've had some really exciting speakers so far to kind of give us the lay of the land, so to speak, and an update on where we are in this legislative environment, and also how you as your group can support your members by working with the process and your place inside that process. And Charles has done an amazing job in giving us those instructions and overviews and putting together such a great team to do the presentation. But now I'm very excited to turn it back to Charles to welcome our very special guest to give us some insights at the federal level and to hear more about where we're going in the next upcoming year or so in terms of what it looks like for housing in the U.S. So Charles, I'm going to turn it back over to you so you can welcome our special guest.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone. And today, and this is a moderated call, so we'll start off that way. And appreciate there'll be lots of questions. Please do not expect anyone at HUD to be able to answer all the questions that we would have for HUD. Please just understand that going in. I don't want to set expectations and beat somebody up for something that they didn't do or weren't a part of. So let's understand that going in. So if you have questions, please do send them in to me. Let me know if there's some things we can get to, and we'll see if we can address some of the questions. But starting off with Todd Richardson is the General Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Office of Policy Development and Research, often referred to as PD&R. These are the guys who are looking at, kind of as Cindy mentioned with the bill and some changes in regulations. PD&R will be all over that bill. Todd's probably already looked at it, knows what's in it. I don't want to set him up for that side of it, but when it comes to where do you go from a HUD perspective, what should we be doing from a HUD perspective? And I say we because HUD represents the country, housing and urban development, and how from a country perspective and a national perspective do we help with housing and urban development. So with that, I want to bring Todd on here, Mr. Richardson, I should say. I appreciate it. He was very easy to speak with, and we've gotten to know each other a little bit. I greatly appreciate a more informal process. And I asked him to kind of give a conversation, give some points and touch it based on a few things. And then we'll have some conversation and Q&A from there. So with that, Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Charles. And Todd is fine. I'm an old bureaucrat. I've been at HUD on and off for quite a long time. In fact, I'm in the historic HUD headquarters building. Now this historic registry. So if you look at my office, it has this paneling. It's classic 1968 paneling. Cannot change it.
Excellent. That's awesome.
It's historically protected. So, but one of the things in my job is, because we don't have an assistant secretary because confirmations are going very slow in the Senate, I serve as the head of the research office at HUD. And that means I oversee all the things that sort of are research and data related. So if you're in the voucher program, you're familiar with income limits and fair market rents. My office produces those numbers. We do research on all the different programs of HUD. We have, FHA sales price limits, we do that, so that kind of thing is the thing my office does. So you might have questions on those topics. When I talked to Charles, whenever we talked, Charles mentioned that a topic you might be interested in is assistance animals. Now, this is not an area where I am an expert. So I had to go and did a little research on this. And so I can talk a little about assistance animals, but mostly I'm going to talk about the HCV program, where we do have a lot of research. And I know a number of your members are in the voucher program, and we'd actually like more people to be accepting vouchers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our research in this space, what we're trying to do, what we're already doing to try to improve the program, and what we're testing to improve the program. And I know there's legislation out there that's trying to make the program more favorable to landlords. So that's sort of the gist of my presentation here. I'm also happy to answer questions on any number of topics or try to answer questions. If not, if I can't answer, I can bring it back to other folks at HUD. So I'm going to start off with sort of the assistant animal question. So as I understand it, there's a growing number of tenants that are saying that they need to have an assistance animal. And that means that you, of course, as a landlord, need to assess if their request should be granted as a reasonable accommodation for those with a disability under the Fair Housing Act. So now I'm sorry to say that I have no new information on this topic. We have guidance from January of 2020, and I think Charles is sharing with you sort of a number of links, including that guidance and a fact sheet of frequently asked questions. So here's what I can offer. If you don't know that guidance, I hope this is helpful to you. If you do know that guidance and you would like to have HUD think about other issues, if you could share, you can share with Charles your thoughts on what we should be doing in terms of improving our guidance in this area, and I can pass it along to the people who actually work on this. It's, this kind of thing is always sort of a process, takes a long time. So that's all I got on assistance animals. I'm going to shift gears now to our housing choice voucher program. So as you know, called Section 8, HCV, variety of other things. But this program doesn't work without landlords. You are the most critical player in this program. If tenants can't lease a unit, our housing subsidy is useless. So thank you for the many of you who do provide housing for our voucher tenants. Our research shows that what you're doing when you do that is you are dramatically reducing the number of homeless Americans. So when we look at our data on folks that are on the waiting list, and people wait 2 or 3 years for this program on the wait list, they're cycling in and out of homelessness. And when they are able to lease a unit with a voucher after they've made their way to the wait list and they get a voucher, that pretty much stops for the vast majority of them. And so that's why this is such an important program in the voucher program. And we need landlords. And we know that this program can be difficult for landlords. And we're trying to make some improvements in that area. So we did some research back in 2018 to try to get a better handle on what the issues are that landlords are concerned with. So I'm going to relay to you what we learned from that. You can sort of decide whether or not you think our findings are relevant to your experience. So we see that when you as a landlord deciding to accept a tenant with a housing choice voucher, you're going to do a benefit cost analysis. You're going to weigh your acceptance against a hypothetical tenant that you might otherwise rent to in the open market. So your calculation on acceptance of an HCV might be, for example, on the benefit side, it provides a steady income and low turnover. For most of our tenants, since the PHA pays you directly for the majority of the rent, and the average tenancy is 7 to 8 years, that can be a good thing for many landlords. Others of you might just be doing it because you think it's a good thing to do, and it is a good thing to do. On the cost side, on the other hand, there's inspections, and I came in a little early, so I did hear inspections mentioned several times, where I can actually give a history of why this program has inspections, but only if someone asks. The general bureaucracy of the PHA, sometimes it feels like this program is still being run in the 1970s because it was started in the 1970s. If you've had a past experience that's been negative with a PHA or with a tenant, that can be sort of like turn you off to the program. So those are some of the things sort of that turned up in our research. So since 2018, when we did this research, we've been trying to improve the program in a number of ways. So our first thing we did was we actually went out and had listening sessions with landlords, something that we actually had not done. We didn't actually listen to landlords. We finally got out, we went out and listened to landlords, and we heard what you had to say. And And we think we need to keep doing that. So we're just pushing out guidance right now to our PHAs and others on sort of like doing more of that, going out locally, listening to your local landlords, find out where their pain points are. The other thing is education. You know, we need to do better education for landlords about the program, and we need to do better education for PHAs on what they could be doing to make the program work better. So, you know, landlords, you are a diverse bunch of folks. You know, you've got a lot of landlords who own just a couple of units. You know, there may be as many as 10 million landlords in the United States. So, you know, I was a landlord accidentally because I couldn't sell my house. That's not unusual. And then there's other folks. I work for a nonprofit that sort of had about the number of units a lot of you probably had. I don't know, we had 15, 20 units of rental units. A lot of them were HCV units. And then of course, there's the larger landlords. NMHC was on here earlier, and so they represent a lot of large landlords. But it's a diverse group, and it changes. So you have to have constant, easy to access education. So we have created you know, this is interesting that we hadn't done this up to this point. We've created a new website for landlords. So if you go to, actually, there's a link on here for our Housing Choice Voucher landlord resources. We've created simple one-pagers and schematics of how the whole process works with vouchers to at least let folks know this is how this program works. So if a landlord's interested in the program, they can actually do a little research before they jump in. And so they can see how the program works. The same thing for PHAs. On this same page, might interest you, are sort of like our pushing out to them, hey, there are best practices that many of you don't do to make this program work better for landlords. And we're trying to get our PHAs to pick this up. Some PHAs are excellent, do a great job. Other PHAs, there's 2,500 of them, don't do such a great job. And we're trying to get them, everybody, to do a better job. So those are a number of the things. So anyways, I encourage you to look at that research page for the PHAs. So, and I want to, and I can't reiterate the importance of this. So we have 115,000. I have that interesting post. I have 115,000. We have 115,000 tenants right now looking for a unit to rent. And they have vouchers in hand and they're searching for housing. That's 115,000. That's a lot. That's more than we usually have on the streets. There's a lot of tenants out there looking for units. So give the HCV program consider the HCV program if you haven't used it. Okay, so that's the sort of like the big picture there. Here's things we're doing right now to try to figure out if we can make this program even better. You know, this program has a long history of statutes and regulations. To change them isn't simple. But we're trying to. So we have two different paths. One is, I'll call it the more money path. And so we have this demonstration we're doing now, we call the mobility. It's a mobility demonstration. It's building off some research we did a number of years ago that showed that when low-income families are able to lease a unit in a opportunity-rich neighborhood, the children, when they become adults, do better economically. And at the time that the families make the move, there's big health benefits for the adults. A lot of people live in pretty tough neighborhoods. Moving to a higher opportunity neighborhood has big positive impacts for them. So we're doing this demonstration called the Community Choice Demonstration. There are 13 PHAs. We've provided them 10,000 vouchers to try to help families move into more opportunity-rich neighborhoods. To do this, we provide the housing authorities more money to do things like have housing navigators for the families, have landlord specialists to help work with landlords through issues, offer more payment flexibilities. Anyways, try to figure out what the kitchen sink of things we could do to improve people's success at leasing units and higher and more opportunity-rich neighborhoods with the kids. The other path is I'll call it the less regulation path. So we have another demonstration where we've asked 29 PHAs to test program flexibilities. So those, more flexibility around fair market rent standards, payment, sort of dealing with payments for tenant caused damage, doing 1 month vacancy loss payments in between HCV tenants, because we know the inspection costs you money. So if you can get paid for a month, well, to deal with any inspection issues, instead of having the unit vacant, that might help, and other things like that. But those are regulatory changes that we're testing, right? In this, and for these 29. So in the link, I have links to those two things in case you happen to be in the market with these PHAs doing these demonstrations. You might check it out, see if that's something you'd be interested in helping out with. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about was refugees. So, we obviously can see in the news the big issues in Europe right now with the Ukrainian refugees, but of course in the United States, we've also been trying to resettle Afghan refugees from the events from folks that were moving here from Afghanistan after we left Afghanistan. So the State Department and the Office of Refugee Resettlement at HHS are leading the resettlement and integration efforts, but HUD is trying to support that effort both with giving you more guidance about how you can lease to refugees in a way that doesn't violate the Fair Housing Act, and other ways of trying to get more landlords to lease units to refugees. We have a website that I'm also put on that Charles has passed along, or Lori, I guess, has passed along for folks to look at. Anyways, with that, I'll hand it back to Charles. I'm happy to answer any questions folks have on most any topic, or at least try to. So with that, I'll pass it back to Charles.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it. Sorry for our momentary hack there. So active IT working on the other side of that right now. So apologies, we'll keep moving on here. So you mentioned, first of all, thank you for saying thank you. It's one of those, sometimes when you're working with programs, you're like, we're trying to help and do things. So that it's appreciated. It's not overlooked that you say thank you. It is appreciated for that. So a couple of things, the best management practices, is that something that from a local level, our folks can then kind of go to those links that you shared, and I just reposted again, and say, hey, please consider X, HUD recommends these, and is that something more from a top-down perspective? How would you best suggest we participate in that?
Well, that's actually a great point. So every PHA has a board of directors, and they have board of director meetings. And they're, I think going to those meetings or encouraging the PHA to have a listening session with landlords and setting up so we're trying to encourage our PHAs to do listening sessions. If landlords are also asking the PHAs to do a listening session with landlords, I think that is a great thing, like inviting them to come to an association meeting that's local to say, hey, this is what we're seeing, and looking at the best practices that we're putting out there gives you something to point to, right? HUD says this is something that you might consider doing. That's probably helpful because they can then look at it too and say, oh, we hadn't, you can get in the habit of doing something and not realize that there's other things you could do to change. So I would definitely say if you have members who are interested in working with the housing authority, that reach out and maybe offer an opportunity to have a conversation.
All right. So one of the questions we had coming in, especially considering the high inflation rate we're in from a rental perspective, but I mean, we see it everywhere from cost of gas, cost of sewer. I don't have to explain it. Everybody does. Everybody goes to the grocery store. So we all know it's out there. When it comes to the FMRs and looking at calculating those and trying to keep those some correlation there, is there going to be an adjustment in their timeframes? Do you think they'll be adjusted more often or stay on more of an annual basis or every couple of years? How do you think that'll be? Is there a process to consider that at this point?
So this is a big deal, right? We've been in a low inflationary environment. Rents have been going up pretty healthily, but generally we've been in a low inflationary environment for a long time.
Right.
So this sort of rapid increase in costs for you as landlords and rapidly increasing rents in markets, we are definitely looking at that and trying to figure out how we manage in this environment to make sure that we're keeping up with the market. And, you know, fair market rents are a tricky business because every market is different. This is a big country. And we try very hard to try to keep tabs on what's happening there. But where fair market rents come from is that we start with survey data from the American Community Survey, and then we get other data sources to try to figure out how do we push this. So we capture what's happened since the ACS data, right? And growth in rents cost from the ACS data. And then how do we project that forward? How do we think what the next year is going to look like? So, and you know, we have a lot of papers, research papers we've written on this, et cetera. But we're continuing to look at that and saying, this market is different. We have to figure out how to keep up with this market. And, you know, rents, you know, home sales price exploded. Rents were lagging. Now rents are exploding in a lot of markets. So we're trying to make sure that we're keeping up with that as much as we can. That has a monetary, so for you as landlords, you're like, you know, our costs are going up. We need to be able to get a higher, you know, rent and the subsidy on the rent. The flip side of that, of course, is that subsidy has to be there, right? Because if all of the 2.3 million voucher tenants suddenly have a big increase in how much we're paying in subsidy, that has to come from somewhere, and Congress appropriates that, right? That's in the appropriations bill. And if we don't actually have enough money, that means the housing authorities will have to reduce the number of people they're serving. So there's all these tensions around this. But, you know, to get to your main point, are we looking at this question of rents going up? Yes. And are we looking at lots of data sources? Yes. So more to come on that. I'm sure that whatever we come up with, your members won't love. And I'm sure that whatever we come up with, the advocates won't love. And I'm sure the appropriators won't love it. So part of being a bureaucrat is that we do something that everybody hates and maybe it's okay.
That's a fair point. That's kind of how the sausage is made, right? At the end, everybody likes the sausage. So,
Yeah.
So another question was asked, and I'm going to put it in more kind of general terms, is in situations where we've had, and I've been a property owner, had residents, and occasionally you have a resident who will really trash a place, whether it's a hoarding situation that now you're left with bringing in 5 dump trucks to get rid of everything and 10 guys over an extended period of time, even after going through a whole process, local health authorities and all that, to a situation where there's a bust and residents taken out and it was meth or it was heroin and there's residue in the unit. If that is somebody under a HAP contract, that has been a pain point for our members because there's a very limited security deposit and no backfill after that. So is there a consideration of that for some sort of backfill, or and maybe I'll put it that way as an incentive to consider? Because occasionally we get somebody, and I'll share it this way, Todd, we did a survey and actually had about 15-20% of our membership say, yeah, I've participated in housing choice voucher. I'm not sure I want to do it again. And in one sense, I was actually encouraged because that was a lower number than I had feared. So, but I put that out there as one incentive potential or consideration.
Well, you know, I mentioned this demonstration we're doing with 29 PHAs. We have seen, so there are a number of PHAs that are in what we call the moving to work program. That means they have deregulatory flexibilities and they can do more things with their HAP subsidy than the other PHAs. So there's 39 PHAs that are already in that, and now we have 29 more that we're testing some things on flexibilities. And one of the things we're hoping to see more to test out more is just this, like, if we create sort of these, if you will, an insurance pool that says, if your unit gets trashed, we'll help cover some of that cost up to a certain amount, right? Beyond what your security deposit is covered.
Right.
How does that work? And is that a successful model so that landlords, you know, when this happens, and hopefully it happens rarely, that having this backstop makes landlords more willing to accept vouchers, right? This is something we're trying to, how big of a difference would it make to landlords if we offered this kind of a backstop if a unit's damaged, right? And so we're hoping these housing authorities that are part of this demonstration, that several of them will do it so that we can see, you know, from our perspective, it's like, okay, this is an interesting idea and improves things for land. How much does it cost? Right? Everything's a benefit cost analysis.
Right.
Does it cost us a lot and no new landlords join the program? That's kind of that, you know,
Right.
It costs a lot and we get a lot of new landlords. Does it not cost very much and we get a lot of new landlords? I mean, I think that's kind of what we're trying to find out, is if how effective that is as a tool.
So, and I think that's one where the listening sessions can really help on something like that to figure out what level of participation. And we're using the initials PHA just for everyone, the Public Housing Authority that's out there, and that's 2,500 of them that report to HUD. And I'll say loosely report to HUD sometimes is the way it feels, because they also have their own boards that they have to report to as well. So there is a tension there. And
right. Well, think of us as the bank. We provide the money and some rules about the money.
That's it.
At the end of the day, those housing authorities are independent from us, and they have their own boards of directors, and they make decisions within the rules that we, you know, and you know, the PHAs would like to have more room to work.
Mm-hmm.
That's the right deregulation. And so we're testing out, okay, if we're going to do that, is that work out better?
Gotcha. All right. Well, we're coming up close on our time. I'll just wrap up. One of the issue that was raised was when somebody, as a participant in a Section 8 HAP, housing choice voucher, and they violate the lease with the PHA or HUD, as we put them in both together in our mind because that's how we're dealing with it, and they violate, and then the lease or the funding is terminated. Then the residents or the property owner is left with a resident who's no longer funded and has to go through the eviction process with them. So I don't know if there's stronger partnership process that can occur there, or communication. I don't know if you guys have looked at that.
Right. So I think this is the issue about what is the role of the PHA in the relationship with the tenant. For your other tenants, there isn't a third party.
Right.
Your relationship is directly with your tenants. In the case of tenants receiving subsidy for the housing choice voucher program, you've got a third player at the table as the PHA. And what should their role be? So in a purely sort of like economic sort of, if an economist were to design the voucher program, they'd say, we're just providing the money. We don't want to get in between you and the tenant. And that's kind of sort of the philosophy of the HCV program. But we're recognizing that a lot of landlords are like, wait a second, you hold the money. This tenant actually is concerned a lot about what you have to say as the PHA. You should be part of the party here in this relationship. So again, going back to this sort of thing where first off, going back to best practices on that website I described, there are PHAs that are sort of implementing best practices to have landlord liaisons, right? Folks that landlords have a direct line to at the PHA to call up and say, I'm having this trouble. What can you do to help out in this space, right?
Absolutely.
That's something that some agencies have done. Now, this is all subject to their own funding, right? They have the way PHAs are paid, we pay them an admin fee for running this program, and sort of like digging really deep into the weeds here. We've studied our formula for allocating this admin fee, and for some PHAs, it's quite good. And for some PHAs, it's quite bad.
Right.
So some PHAs actually really have some budgetary issues that prevent them from being helpful, and others have pretty good funding that can allow them to do some of this flexibility. So, deep in the weeds of regulatory change, we'd like to fix that problem, but we have not succeeded at doing that yet. But in any case, some PHAs might be able to do this kind of landlord liaison type thing because their budget allows for it. Others might not.
Absolutely. So I appreciate it. One thing I'll encourage you, PDR, to look at, and since I'm talking to the acting assistant secretary, appreciate that. Congratulations on that. Or my sympathies or condolences is another way of saying it.
I like to say I have the responsibilities. I don't,
Yeah. It's like,
like
oh
we get
boy.
a confirmed assistant secretary.
So the one issue that we deal with, and we've seen growing increasingly, even if we mentioned with the animals earlier, is fake applications. And the fictitious aspect, Cindy mentioned it earlier. Tyler mentioned it even on the applications. We've seen it from fake payroll paperwork to, somebody turns in, and one of the easiest ways to figure out that it's a fake payroll is because the numbers didn't add up. And I was like, wait a second, you're telling me you made less the second month? So some of those things we were able to find, but there are literally websites out there that allow it because it's a quote unquote novelty. And when we've spoken to HUD in the past with different folks, it's been even the issue of, they shared with us, the solicitor previous administration had shared with me that he had to send his laptop down to IT because as he was doing research on the companion animal issue, he got so many pop-up ads that it locked up his computer. So there's that sites that you can go to that will give you a fake indication that this animal is legitimately a companion animal when it's really not. And so that's two areas of kind of concern, whether it's the person that we're screening on the inside or the animal or pet that we're screening, and being able to get through that. That's one area that we really struggle with across the board. So if I can encourage, and we'll be happy to provide any assistance from research side, but that's one that we struggle with.
I'll pass that one along. That's very interesting. Yeah.
All right. So with that, Todd, really thank you for your time today. I know we held you late at the office today. Appreciate it. And thank you again for your time.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you. So our next speaker, if you've been reading him, whether you know it or not, if you read anything that National REIA puts out, and we look to an economic expert, Chris Kuehl is fantastic with his insight. He was a insightful speaker at one of our mid-years, and we've reached out to him on a regular basis, and he's been very gracious to provide insights, updates. I've periodically reached out and said, what does this mean? Or, and sometimes I feel like we have that Yoda conversation of, oh, the future is dark. Dark is the future right now. And it's like, okay. So, and with that in mind, I asked him to come on today because with interest rates, with inflation, we only got a quarter point out of the Fed recently, but instead of the Fed saying they're going to raise rates 3 times this year, they're now saying we're looking at up to 7 times. Where does this go? And so with that, I've asked Chris. Chris has experience. He actually worked for the federal government and helped provide information that was, from an economic perspective, went into and kind of in that format of the president's update, which I will encourage you, Brad, if you'll put the link up there for him as well, or Lori, either one. There's a newsletter that Chris puts out. It's 2 to 3 times a week. There's updates, and I will tell you, it is critical. I listen to it avidly. It is short, it's to the point, and the idea is in the morning. It's the morning update that the president receives, and that's the kind of information when you're trying to make business decisions. getting through all the weeds, getting through all the silliness to get to what really counts is critical. So with that, Chris, I'd like to bring you up on screen here. If you
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you.
There
And as far as the introduction is concerned, yeah, my engagement with the government was a little while back. And what makes it interesting now is that I was a Soviet studies specialist. So back in the 80s, that was my intent. I was going to be a spook and work for the agency and study the evil empire, and lived in Leningrad for a year and learned Russian and all this stuff. And then they had the poor taste to go out of business in the middle of my PhD. So I have waited a number of decades to be relevant. The Cold War is back, and I'm so happy. So not really, but that's kind of my background. So what Charles asked me to do is to talk briefly about what's going on with the Fed and interest rates, and then kind of open it up for his conversation and any other questions that are going on. What's always interesting is that I don't know that people in the media ever actually understand what they're talking about. So, which makes it difficult for the rest of us to follow. The federal funds rate, which is what the Open Market Committee controls, is really a very simple tool. All it is the recommended rate that commercial banks charge one another in the overnight lending market. So it is not a requirement. It is not something that banks have to adhere to. It is a recommended rate. Now, traditionally, the banks respond to it immediately, and that's what they do when they're trading with one another. But all the other rates, prime rates and mortgage rates and car loan rates and interest on credit cards, everything else, that's still a bit of a judgment call. Banks can, if they want to, follow the lead of the Fed funds rate. They can ignore it. They can go on either side of it. They can, so it isn't necessarily automatic. And the interesting thing also about the Fed right now, and people are still, I think, remembering the Fed of Alan Greenspan or Paul Volcker, where they didn't tell anybody anything until the last possible moment. I don't know if people remember the squawk box back in the day used to try to measure Greenspan's briefcase and try to figure out what that meant about rate, so we have been operating under the Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Jeremy Powell Fed for well over a decade and a half. This is the show all your cards, open up to the world Fed. They telegraph their shots. They don't want to be a surprise. So it kind of shocked me when the press was like, "Oh my God, the Fed raised it by only a quarter point," like they've been saying they're going to do for about 6 months. It's like, hello. So the Fed has basically said, look, 90%, well, actually the actual number is 70% of the inflation that we're dealing with right now is not related to money supply. It is related to commodities. And the Fed has virtually no control over commodities. And people don't quite understand even why interest rate hikes control inflation. It's deceptively simple. Basically, the idea is that if there's a lot of money in the economy, people can ignore inflation. They'll complain about it, and they'll say, man, that's outrageous. But if they've got the money, they pay for it anyway. We saw that last year. I mean, people were flush with cash from the stimulus and all the rest of it. So when the prices started going up, people were saying, boy, that's really expensive, but look at all the money I have. I can afford this. I can do it. I want it. I'm going to buy it anyway. And if you suck that money out of the economy, whether it's on the business side or the consumer side, they start becoming price sensitive and they start reacting to the inflation. And it's a brutal way of controlling inflation because it's basically going to really hurt the low income, the people who can't get their wages to catch up, because they're going to start facing higher prices and they don't have the money to respond. So it's a blunt instrument, and the Fed has always acknowledged that it's a blunt instrument. They're basically, if you think back to the last time we had a really serious inflation hit, which was in the 1980s, and Paul Volcker jammed the interest rates up, he threw the country into recession.
Right.
And people would look at him and say, but Chairman Volcker, you're throwing the country into recession. He goes, damn right I am. And I told you I was going to, and I told you it was going to hurt. And if you don't like it, that's too damn bad. I mean, Volcker was blunt, and many of the Fed people have been just about as blunt. So if you look at what the Fed is thinking now, first off, they want to see if this even has an impact. So they're going to do these quarter point increases, see if it has any real impact on inflation. Also watch closely whether commodity prices settle down. Their long-term concern is the wage price spiral, that as wages go up, costs of production go up, so the producers raise their prices, which then causes wages to go up again, which then cause prices to go up again, and you just get this build, this cycle. And that's the part the Fed worries about most, because once wages go up, they don't come down. Commodities are always transitory. They always go up and down. And again, part of the challenge is to get people to quit equating transitory with temporary. That's not what it means. The press kept looking at it going, well, it's not transitory, it's lasted for months. It's not the same word. Transitory could take years. But if you look at every commodity, no matter what it is, oil, lumber, steel, copper, wheat, it goes up and down like an EKG. It follows demand and supply. You may have a very long period of time where the supply is very high and it keeps the prices down. You may have a long period of time where demand is high and keeps the prices up. But it's always volatile. It always goes up and down. The trouble with wages is they basically do this. They go up and they don't come down. Now, eventually, companies will find a way to reduce their labor costs. They'll use more robotics. They'll fire older workers to hire younger, cheaper ones, but that's not quick. So the part that the Fed worries about mostly is that wage price spiral. And one last thing to point out, and then I'll shut up and we can do questions. The Open Market Committee is made up of the Board of Governors plus 4 regional Fed presidents. And these 4 have a lot of influence because they're the eyes and ears of the Fed. Every year you have a new set of 4. Last year, the 4 were either neutral or dovish when it comes to rates. But this year, starting in January, you have 2 of the most hawkish regional Fed presidents in the system. You have Esther George from the Kansas City Fed and Loretta Mester from the Cleveland Fed. Way back in 2008, when the decision was made to drop rates down to 0, it was an 11-to-1 vote. And the one that dissented was Tom Honig of the Kansas City Fed. Esther is his disciple. She is this charming middle-aged woman until the subject of inflation comes up, and then she sounds like something out of The Exorcist. Inflation is evil. I mean, she does not like having rates this low. She's joined by Loretta Mester. Loretta Mester has a similar relationship with a retired Fed president from Philadelphia. And Charles Plosser was extremely hawkish. She used to be his head of research. So these 2 are sitting on the Open Market Committee right now, looking for any reason whatsoever to push rates up because they've been worried about them beyond inflation. You know, they don't like what low rates do to people who are trying to save. They don't like what low rates did to the stock market. People were able to borrow money very cheaply, jump into the market, make a lot of money, come out of it, pay the loan back. And Esther and Loretta keep saying, yes, you can do that until the market corrects. And this week, there's been an awful lot of people who are like, oh, crap. I wasn't expecting the market to die, and I don't know how I'm going to pay my loan back. And there's a lot of banks that are like, yeah, we didn't figure in the Ukraine invasion. And it's like, well, neither did anybody else. And now that's why people like Esther George and Loretta must have worried about it. Another new member is Jim Bullard from the St. Louis Fed, and he tends to be kind of hot and cold, but he just stated that he thought rates should be close to 3% by the end of the year, which is a pretty hawkish position. The Fed is still saying 2.5 at top. Some of the others are saying no, it's more likely to be maybe 1.5 to 2. We'll see. But that's kind of where the Fed's head is at. It's going to be probably the most read publication in the financial world when the minutes come out from this last meeting. It's going to be like, okay, who was ready to punch who at this meeting? You know, what were their positions? So I know you all read the Fed minutes faithfully, but these will be really interesting when they come out. So with that, what else do you want to talk about?
Well, so to that point, a couple of questions. So do we, there was some conversation. I've got multiple questions. Can you tell?
I can tell.
Which one do I start with? So to give a more consistent answer for everybody and to follow, originally there was a discussion even last year. I think Jerome Powell had mentioned about going for 3 to 4 and updates or interest rate increases.
Right.
And now they're talking smaller amounts, but more of them. And the critique that I see most frequently of the Fed is that they are too little, too late. And then you kind of get Volcker's situation where he just clamps down hard.
Right.
And then we are definitely in recession. Do you see, and we'll talk about the Russia-Ukraine thing afterwards, but with where we're currently at, is there a process to move this country to kind of slowly eke that money back out? And is the quarter point process the right way to do it? Is it slow enough, soft enough, or is it still going to result in the same kind of situation?
Yeah, I think the major problem is that, well, there's two. Number one, that huge money supply, we blew through that last year. We went into 2021 with about $5 trillion in excess savings. During 2020, we were dumping all this money into the economy to stimulate it, except that people couldn't spend it because we had shut down the service sector. You know, that was, here's some money, go spend it. And the consumer said, on what? You shut everything down. 65% of what we spend our money on is on services, and you just made those inaccessible. So what are we supposed to do? We saved for a brief period of time at a 30% rate when we normally save at a 7% rate. But we managed to blow through all that because if there's one thing Americans are good at, it's consuming. And we went nuts last year. We ended up spending heavily in the holiday season. You know, we did well. We blew through most of that money. So the money supply is not much of a consumer issue, but it's still a business issue. You still have corporate profits are at a level that has not been seen in quite a while. You're seeing a lot more corporate spending. You still have a lot of M&A going on. That's kind of where the Fed is putting its energies when it comes to inflation. But the key thing, and it's kind of obvious but not obvious, is that so much of the inflation now is related to energy. You've had a 700% increase in the price of natural gas in Europe, which trickled over to the US. You have had oil prices jumping as high as $140 a barrel and then falling to 90 and then back to 120. The average price per gallon in the United States is over $4. So all of a sudden, you're driving inflation with a factor that interest rates don't have much impact on. And so the reaction of the Fed is to say, well, you know, you can say this is too little, too late, but what do you suggest we do? Do you want us to, you know, physically the entire board of governors invades Russia and seizes their oil? That's the issue. You know, we don't. And when you look at the oil producers, and not to further muddy the waters, the oil producers look at all of this and say, we see the demand. We do. We understand there's been a crisis in the sector, but understand it from our perspective. In order for us to meet these new production demands. Even if we started today, it's going to be 9 months, 8 months before much of this comes on. So that's two problems. Number one, it doesn't solve your immediate issue, but number two, it means we have to count on this demand being here 8 or 9 months from now. And they look at the circumstances involved with Russia. We've seen it in the last week. Rumors start to circulate that maybe there's a ceasefire. Maybe the Russians are going to back off. Maybe the talks are going okay, and the price per barrel of oil drops to 90. Then it's like, nope, it's not going to happen. Putin is a nutball. He's going to launch nuclear weapons at New York, and the prices go back up again. The oil companies look at that and say, this is a crisis that could conceivably end any day. And we are cynical enough to understand that if the Russians gave the West any sort of an excuse to start lowering those sanctions, they will. So if Russia comes to the table and says, okay, we made our point, we're pulling out, we're done, the West is going to go, okay, that was really awful of you, but can we start buying your oil and gas again? Because we're desperate for it. I mean, if the United States is willing to start working with Venezuela and Iran in order to get oil, they're going to be willing to work with Russia if Russia gives them an out and says, okay, we're sorry, we didn't mean to, my bad, and starts to move in that direction. The oil companies are looking at one factor above everything else, and that's the daily commute. They know that almost 92% of the fuel consumption in the United States is by motorists going back and forth to work. It's 30 miles each way, 30 minutes each way. That's how we consume fuel. Right now, 40% of us are back to our offices. The other 60% are still working remotely. And the oil companies are going, hey, until that changes, we don't see permanent demand. And we're not going to ramp up to deal with what we think could be a temporary problem. So it's kind of ironic that, not ironic, but it's frustrating that the oil companies are looking at current crisis and saying, well, we're really not going to react to it. What we're really interested in is people getting out of their pajama bottoms and going back to work like normal people. So it's kind of a nutty world.
So I appreciate that. It's interesting. There's a deeper issue there, which you kind of touched on, which is if 40% are back working in the office, 60 are not.
Right.
And I've seen in your writings discussions that somewhat businesses need to realize this is a transition that's coming. We've been talking to our folks about it, that you need to start planning. And I've heard from a number of folks who are in the rehab business who are making sure that they put an office in whatever space they're putting in, because looking at more hybrid and remote options.
Exactly. Because you start looking at the motivation for working remotely. And early on, it was COVID. People were trying to stay away from the potential for infection. But now businesses have learned you can recruit differently. You can basically hire somebody that doesn't want to leave where they're living and say, I don't care, you're going to work remotely anyway. It's kind of like, as people were wrestling with, how do people function remotely? My company has functioned remotely for 23 years. Mm-hmm. Our clients are all over the world. I've not even met most of them. It's like I've only seen them on Zoom calls, and in some cases, I've never actually physically seen their face at all. I just do work and I send it to them, and they say, that's nice. And I say, good, send me money. It kind of works out that way. So we're getting more and more comfortable with this way of doing business, and that is definitely affecting construction. It is really affecting commercial office space. There's not as much of it being built. The construction sector on the commercial side is growing again, but it's predominantly warehousing and distribution or manufacturing driven. And on the residential side, you're seeing a little bit of a slowdown of that single family demand that existed when COVID first hit. People are not as interested in relocating out to the exurbs and in remote areas, though that's still happening. I mean, I was talking to the Iowa Department of Economic Development at one point. They consider Chicago or Des Moines to be a suburb of Chicago. There are so many people working for Chicago companies from Des Moines because it's like, look, I can get into Chicago 2 or 3 times a month if I need to. But when I sold my place in Chicago, do you know what I was able to get in Iowa? You know, I was talking to a guy that sold a $2 million brownstone where if you reached out, you could touch your neighbor. He took that $2 million and he's got a 5,600 square foot house on 3.5 acres outside Ames. He's like, I don't know, just between you and me, it's kind of nice that I honestly couldn't hit my neighbor if I threw as hard as I could, you know. So there's a lot of that kind of realization. And as you guys have been dealing with for years, I mean, you've got the generational differences. You know, millennials are much more comfortable with doing remote work. Boomers still resist it. Gen Xers are kind of confused. And then you've got Gen Z that's just not even sure they want to work at all, much less remotely or in person. And if you really want to get scared, the next generation coming up is being referred to as the digitals. So it's like we're all doomed. So
I guess an interesting name. I hadn't heard that before. That's an interesting title for them. So let me ask you a two-pronged question. And part of it we can set aside, which is the black swan issue of Russia, Ukraine, and it's maybe transitory, if I can use that word properly.
Right, there you go.
Impact on things. But the demographics you mentioned, whether it's the millennial aspect or not, there's fewer people coming through the pipeline, which should mean that there's going to be less demand for housing. And how do we, from a longer term, prepare for what's next and what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think that that's a problem that stretches even beyond housing, because retail's trying to figure it out, and virtually every segment of the economy is adjusting to the fact that the most dominant cohort in probably U.S. history is sliding out slowly. Boomers are not doing it the way one would have predicted. I mean, boomers hit retirement at the rate of 10,000 a day, and the majority of boomers put it off. And we're notorious for not having lives to begin with, so we never quit. But staying in the workforce in your 60s into your 70s, yeah, that's okay. Once you start hitting mid 70s, late 70s, it's like, okay, I'm done. I really want to retire now. I'm through. And you've got the smallest cohort, which is the Gen Xers coming right behind them. And the biggest population is millennials. There's 43 million of them. But they've just started to kind of get into kind of the meat of their careers. They're now into their 30s, pushing into their early 40s. What's good news, I think, for housing is that the millennials were slow to begin to emulate their elders, but they're getting there. All of a sudden, they're having children. They're having children much later than boomers did, much later even than Gen Xers did. And nothing seems to motivate the desire for single family housing like children. It's like you suddenly want a house with razor wire and a moat. You know, I mean, it's just like, oh my God. So that's driving some of that, but they're driving it in kind of different ways. I mean, the millennial has shown, and this is a kind of a gross generality, boomers and even Gen Xers didn't particularly care where they moved. They kind of moved for the job. They moved because the opportunity was compelling. The millennials are moving to a specific place, and they don't really care what they do when they get there. So the millennials are driving Austin and Nashville and Florida. It's kind of like, you know, why are you moving to Austin? Do you have a job there? No, but I want to live in Austin. and I'll figure it out when I get there. The boomer is like, where are you moving? I'm moving to Topeka. You're moving to Topeka, Kansas? Why? Good job. Do you want to live in Topeka? Hell no. But it's a good job, and I'm going to move to Topeka. So it's a different mindset. And then we run into the new version of work, which is the gig economy. I gave a talk to the Dry Cleaners Association about a month ago, and their biggest threat right now is internet laundry. Women that were kind of forced back home because of schools and all that stuff discovered, I can post on my neighborhood internet that I will do other people's laundry, and people will just drop it off at my house, and I've got a washing machine and a dryer, and the average take home for somebody doing internet laundry is $350 a day. If you have a job at minimum wage, it's $120 a day. So what would you rather do? Run your washer and dryer in the other room, make $350, do other people's laundry, and you start adding in Uber driving and, clearing people's sidewalks. I mean, we had a windstorm in Kansas City, and within hours, this guy shows up in a pickup truck with a chainsaw. First thing out of his mouth is, do you or any member of your family work for the IRS? No. Do you need some trees cut? Yep. $500 later, he'd cut some trees, tax-free. And it's like, so now you've got people saying, why don't you get a job? Why in the heck would I get a job? I can make $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a week. Don't pay any. So, it's like, got a question. Are you in Kansas City? Yes, I am. I'm a good Kansas boy. I was actually born in this city. So unlike many of my generation, I'm one of those rare boomers that never left his hometown.
That's awesome. So I'll ask the final question as a wrap up and kind of wrap up for our day. And knowing that in an hour or a day, the whole world could change on this issue. But with your background on Russia, Ukraine, I have to ask the question. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's what has become very obvious is that from the very beginning, Putin had expectations, and both of them have been dashed. Expectation number one was that Ukraine would collapse in less than a week. The assumption was that their army was not prepared, that the population was not going to fight back. That turned out not to be the case. The second assumption was that the Europeans and the Americans would not be able to unite around any sort of serious sanctions, because at first they weren't. I mean, the Europeans were being pretty blunt, saying, look, we depend on Russia for 55% of our fuel, and I'm not sure that we're prepared to do that. So when it turned out that A, Ukraine could fight back, and B, the Europeans and the Americans would unite and would take these hits, because really it's come down more to the Europeans. We import virtually nothing from Russia. We're capable of handling our own energy needs. It'll be more expensive, but certainly doable. Europe is the more vulnerable of the players, and they are united and have done things that the Russians really did not expect, and it's caused a rethink. And the most important thing that's happened, which kind of got overlooked in the media, is Germany has committed to spending €1 billion on upgrading its military. Every time the Germans have said they were going to do that, the French have thrown a fit, and the British have as well, saying under no circumstances should we allow the Germans to rearm. This time, the French came out and said, how many of our Mirage jets would you like to buy? We are all in. We are more than willing. The British said, if you decide to invest in a big Navy, we'll help you blockade the Baltic Sea. It's like Russia just recreated its ancient enemy. And if you don't think the Germans hate Russians and Russians hate Germans, you've not visited either country lately. There's a lot of hostility there. Putin is in a box. He's going to have to back off. He's either going to do it and try to sustain some kind of face-saving measure, basically say, look, we've proven beyond a doubt we can do this, and Ukraine will never join the EU. Or he's going to have to face some internal stress. Russia watchers are looking at this going, you do realize that this country is essentially a military dictatorship. And military dictatorships are frequently overthrown by other people in the military. And in just the first few weeks of this battle, one of the most popular Russian generals was killed, and 3 others have been killed. And there's restiveness in the military. People forget that the group that essentially overthrew the Soviet Union by backing Boris Yeltsin were 100 Afghansi. Remember that scene where these guys came out, here's the whole Russian army prepared to attack Yeltsin, and these 100 guys came out, and the army just dissolved. And it's like, why? Because they're Afghansi. And they looked at these soldiers going, so, son, have you killed anybody? I have. Hundreds. You may kill all of us. For every one of us you kill, 100 of you die. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm a conscript, okay? I just got drafted. I do not want to be killed by an Afghan veteran. I'm out of here. And the whole army dissolved. And you still got a lot of Afghansi who are saying, are you seriously thinking we can occupy that country? We couldn't occupy Afghanistan. So, of course, neither could we or the British, but that's another story.
Or the Greeks or the Persians, but
or the Greeks or the Persians or the Mughal Indians. It's kind of like, why doesn't somebody read history and leave those people alone?
Absolutely. Well, Chris, I really appreciate the time and the perspective on this. And again, your ongoing information. And again, I encourage everyone to follow Chris in his newsletter. Armada is fantastic. I love the Black Armada, the owl. There are different terms for it they use. Black owl, the Armada.
Exactly. We're constantly, you'd think that with just 2 guys, we could agree on something for a while, but Keith and I are always messing with stuff. So yeah, please reach out. And I think the contact, it's got my email on there someplace. So feel free to email me and all that stuff. So
we'll definitely do that. All right, Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And
enjoy the rest of your conference, and maybe you're done and can go drink wildly now. So
we are wrapping up here with this, and I'll turn it back over to our president, Mr. Kuehlman. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Appreciate Chris and Todd today, all of the information that they give us. And of course, always Mr. Tassell for being our liaison to all of this important information. Such an integral part of National REIA and the time and energy and effort that he puts into it. We just greatly, greatly appreciate that from him as well. We do have our events coming up April the 3rd Friday, it's the 3rd Friday, sorry, it's 15th in April. I believe that is going to be an equity ground floor updates. And then we have our quarterly leadership call on the 18th of May. So we will see you guys the next time here, April the 15th. Good luck to everyone, and everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and happy investing.